What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below. Also, if you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. I want to thank all of my viewers and participators for watching these videos each week. We continue to gain success, and I appreciate it. If you'd like to join the channel, please hit the join button. It'll give you perks, access to merch, as well as other private shows that I don't show here on the channel. Hit that join button and show some love. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And on December 11th, 1990, as we know, Gambino boss John Gotti and Samuel the Bull Gravano would be arrested at the Ravenite Social Club. It would be the last time John Gotti would see the streets. Another man would be arrested that night alongside Gotti and Gravano, and not a lot's known about him. Today, though, we're going to get in to the other guy, Frankie Loc, Locascio, a revered individual who spent most of his life in the Bronx. The story of Frank Locascio next on Sit Down Shorts. Francis Anthony Locascio was born September 24th, 1932 in New York City. It was said that Frank Locaccio's family was from a small town in Sicily called Bolsena, just south of Palermo. Frank Locascio would spend his formative years and most of his life in the area of Belmont and Arthur Avenue in the Bronx. If you know anything about the Bronx and or have ever seen the film A Bronx Tale, many of the locations today will center around that area. Frank Locascio was instrumental in the underworld in the Bronx, which actually, as far as the Gambino crime family, goes back many years, which we'll get into. That area of Crescent Avenue, East 187th, Belmont Avenue, and Arthur Avenue was Gambino territory, and Frankie Loc was very involved in that. By the 1950s, it was said that Frankie Locascio was very involved with bookmaking and loan sharking. He was also very adept in numbers running as well, and we'll find out that the individuals that Frank Locascio was around growing up were huge in the numbers rackets in the Bronx in that area. Now, during the 50s, the Bronx was basically run by an individual called Vincent Jimmy Jerome Squilanti. Squilanti was a longtime Bronx man and had for the many years ran the Bronx for the Gambino crime family. Other early associates for Frank Locascio were Felice Teti and Gennaro Mancuso, as well as his brother, Anelio Mancuso. Now, the Mancuso brothers down the road were very involved with the garbage rackets, which were essentially run by Jimmy Brown Fiala, by the Gambino crime family, and obviously the Genovese family as well. It was said that Frank Locascio would actually be made by his 23rd birthday in 1995, still when the family is being run by Albert Anastasia. Frankie Loc would be sponsored for initiation into the family by an individual called Anthony Tony the Geep Sadato. Now, Sadato, which I was unable to find a picture of, alongside his brother Michael Sadato, were very involved with gambling, loan sharking, and other numbers rackets up in the Bronx. Now, Sadato would be a name to keep an eye on because down the road, upon initiation and into the 70s, not only Michael Sadato, but Anthony Sadato as well were very instrumental in the maturation of Frank Locascio in the life. In 1960, Vincent Squilanti was reported missing and ultimately would be found dead. Anthony Sadato would inherit most of Squilanti's crew. Now, by this point, that would include people like Felice Teti, the Mancuso brothers, as well as Frank Locascio. Locascio would come under the flag of Sadato alongside his brother, Michael Sitdown. And by this point, as I said, Frank Locascio becomes one of the biggest bookmakers and numbers runners in the Bronx. And by the early 70s, he controlled a lot of the gambling rackets in and around the Bronx. By this point, though, the FBI was starting to create a bit of a file on Frank Locascio. In a 1970 FBI file, the FBI would state that not only Frank Locascio, but Felice Tati were often seen outside a pet shop at 626 East 180th Street in the Bronx. Now, that pet shop, they would allege, was the headquarters of not only the numbers rackets, but all the gambling stuff they were doing as well. Now, I want to make this clear. The FBI would never bring a case upon these individuals for their involvement, but it is something that is very interesting. It illustrates the fact that Locascio is very involved with gambling, as well as Tati and Michael Sitdown alongside his brother, Anthony Tony the Geep Sitdown, who was the capo of the crew. Things were good for Locascio. By this point, he becomes a father. He has a son called Tori Locascio. He also has a daughter called Lisa. At one point, Locascio would allegedly be in the crew of longtime Gambino capo Joe Zingaro as well. Now, I want to get in to a little piece of Bronx history that I found important to the creation of this video. I recently stumbled across a video done by YouTuber Peter Santinello. Now, in that video, Santinello, seen on the right, would interview the individual on the left, a man called Rich Mancuso. Now, Mancuso is a longtime sports reporter, but he is also an individual that for most of his life lived in the same area of Locascio in the Bronx. Now, I want to make this very clear and crystal clear. Mr. Mancuso is not a mobster. He is not an associate. He's not a made member. He has no connection to the mafia. One thing he would say, though, in that very well done two-part interview, is that Frankie Locascio, basically, according to him, as well as another individual, he would say that Locascio, basically, according to him, quote, was the boss of the neighborhood, and that he and Frank Locaccio's brother Joe were very high up in the organization. Now, we would know that Frank Locascio is very high up in the organization. We do not know a ton about Joseph Locascio, but they would talk very glowingly, not only about Frank Locascio, but Joe Locascio as well. And one of the individuals in the video would state basically that Joe was, alongside Frank, the two people that were running that neighborhood. And by this point, Frank Locascio is a very respected member. By this point, in the late 70s, early 80s, he's in the family almost 30 years. So he's a very respected individual and very well known in that neighborhood. I want to also make it clear, Mancuso and the other individual who did not state his name were very respectable and respected of Locascio. They talked nothing but glowing tales about Frankie Loc. They would also say that Joe Locascio was very involved at one point in harness and horse racing, which is pretty interesting as well. But I strongly urge, I'm going to leave the link of this video in the description of this video. I'd strongly urge you to check it out. Pretty interesting stuff and really well done by Santinello. By this point, and in the early 80s, Frank Locascio would become he was obviously a made member, but he would become a capo of his own crew. One of the individuals that would begin running with him was his son, Salvatore Tori Locascio. Another person that was in constant contact with Locascio was this person, Zef Mustafa, who I did a video about seen here. Mustafa was an Albanian individual who, for most of his life, had no family in America. He would essentially become the adopted son of Frank Locascio. He would eventually become his driver and will constantly ferry him from the Bronx into Manhattan, where he would hang around other members of the crime family, including John Gotti, at the Ravenite Social Club. Mustafa down the road would become a very good earner for the family and was constantly seen at the Ravenite Social Club. He, alongside Tori Locascio, would ultimately be involved in a gigantic porn phone number operation where they made hundreds of millions of dollars for the mafia. Mustafa can owe a lot of his success, as well as Tori, to his father, Frank Locascio. Him and Mustafa both came up under Frankie's tutelage. Now, by 1985, As we know, Paul Castellano is killed, and John Gotti takes over as the boss of the Gambino crime family. Frankie Loc was one of John Gotti's most trusted capo regimes. He was a constant in the family, and he really relates a lot in a way, Frankie Loc, to another person we just talked about, Fat Andy Ruggiano. Both these guys were long-time members of the family. Guys like Joe Pani Armone, Jimmy Brown, these were long-standing members of the family, and Gotti really respected these guys and really took the constant money that they threw up to John. They had a good relationship, a lot of these guys, and Frankie Loc was Gotti's eyes and ears up in the Bronx. He had assembled a very good crew, guys like his son, Zeph Mustafa, Richard Martino, Andy Campos, Sonny Campos. All these guys are very important in the Gambino crime family. And at that point, we're big earners for Gotti. He wanted to make them happy. For John Gotti, he would ultimately make Frank Locascio the acting underboss in the Gambino crime family upon the incarceration of longtime member Joseph Joe Pani Armone. Keep in mind, Pani Armone had been around forever, really even before Frank Locascio. Things were good for Frankie Loc. He was a high-ranking member of the family, and he was basically number two. He, alongside Sammy Gravano, kind of finished out the mantle of the Gambino crime family. Ultimately, Frank Locascio would become consigliere in the early 90s, and Sammy the Bull Gravano became underboss. It was really a flip-flop of positions, but both these individuals were very involved in the day-to-day runnings of the family alongside boss John Gotti. Now, one thing we know about Gotti, and really was his undoing, was his constant conversations, which were done for the most part out of these apartments above the Ravenite Social Club. And at 247 Mulberry Street, the government would come up with a treasure trove of conversations. Now, many of the conversations was mostly John Gotti blabbering off at the mouth, and the listener, and seen and heard very rarely, was Frank Locascio. However, Locascio was there, and he was involved in a lot of conversations. Now, one conversation would involve an individual called Louis DeBono. Now, DeBono was a member of the family, and at one point, Gotti ordered him to report in for a meeting. DeBono didn't come to the meeting, and Gotti would have a very interesting conversation with Locascio. And I'm quoting from a terrific book called The Gotti Tapes, written by an individual called Ralph Blumenthal and John Miller. Now, in that book, Gotti would kind of discuss the current landscape of the family. Gotti would say, quote, Frankie, there's creating and then there's creating. Now, look, Frankie, you want to put your head with a fucking Sammy? You're too bright for that. DB, did he ever talk subversive to you? Locascio would respond, never. Gotti would then follow it up. He never talked it to Angelo. He never talked it to Joe Piney. I took Sammy's word that he talked about me behind my back. Louis DeBono, did he ever talk to any of you guys? Locascio, no. Gotti would respond, I took Sammy's word. Louis DeBono, I sat with this guy. I saw the papers and everything. He didn't rob nothing. You know why he's dying? He's going to die because he refused to come in when I called. He didn't do nothing else wrong. Locascio would follow it up with, quote, did you have that meeting yet? Gotti respond, no, I'm going to have it tomorrow. Locascio would say, because at the meeting, I predict he's going to bring you 50. Gotti said, well, I wouldn't take nothing. Locascio, you don't think? Gotti, I wouldn't even take it, Frankie. I'm not a goon. I'm not a greaseball. Locascio says he's buying it. He's buying you lunch. Gotti says, never take me. Bring me to lunch, Frank. Frank, if it wouldn't be for the other guy, I wouldn't take nothing. That I shouldn't see my kids alive, I will not take nothing. This guy can't bring me nothing. But I should take that and more, the cocksucker. I wouldn't take nothing from him. He's going to get killed because he disobeyed coming. And we had no bad intentions when we first sent him this fucking, but where are we going? What am I going to do here, Frankie? What are we going to do? Every fucking time we're parking a fucking company. Where's the end in all these companies? Now, basically what Gotti is referring to is the fact that DeBono never came to the meeting. Now, when we talk and hear about 50, Frank Locascio is referring to the fact that ultimately he would persuade DeBono to bring 50 grand to John Gotti as kind of a goodwill gesture for not showing up. Gotti's basically responding in this conversation that essentially he doesn't care about the money. He's being killed because he disobeyed. Now, this is a very important conversation, and this would basically do in Frankie Locascio upon what I'm ultimately about to talk about. As we know, on December 11th, 1990, Gotti would be arrested at the Ravenite Social Club. Also arrested that night were Sammy Gravano, the underboss of the family, and Frankie Loc, the consigliere. Now, the government would contend through charges including racketeering, murder, and other RICO charges that basically Frankie Loc was responsible for the death of Louis DeBono, which we'll get to in just a second, and why the prosecutors contend he should have to face charges for his involvement in that hit. Now, John Gotti obviously was facing very similar charges, including other murders as well. Now, prosecutors would contend that Frank Locascio and the fact that his mere presence during the conversation made him guilty, and that during the conversation, according to them, his job as advisor to Gotti was to say, hey, you shouldn't kill this guy. He doesn't deserve to die. If we notice in that conversation, Locascio does not do that. He just kind of agrees with Gotti and just sits there and listens. The government basically contends that he should have spoken up and prevented the murder. Ultimately, as we know, DeBono is killed at the World Trade Center. So this was a big problem. And most of what ultimately happens to Locascio centers around the murder on DeBono. Now, I will contend, and again, I occasionally give my opinion on this. Do I feel that Locascio, as a gangster, look, he's not going to step in and say, you shouldn't kill him. He attempted to give money and persuade him to give money, but Gotti was the chief decision maker. What he decided to do was important, and that's very important in the hierarchy of the mafia. Should he have said something? Yeah, as a human, he should have said something. But again, these are gangsters. They're not human. They are human, but they're not, if you know what I'm saying. Should Locascio have said something? Yeah, but again, yeah, if we were normal people on the street, yeah, he should have said something. But these are gangsters. Locascio shouldn't have been contended to say anything. For Frank Locascio, he would get more bad news as well as John Gotti. They would find out that Sammy Gravano was going to testify against them. And look, as we know, that ended up being very damaging for both Frank Locascio and John Gotti. In 1992, Frank Locascio would be convicted on April 2nd of that year. And by June 1992, a sentence would be handed down. Frank Locascio would get life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that would be upheld by the United States Supreme Court. Frank Locascio would head off to jail and would really spend the next 30 plus years of his life there. In this photo in prison, we can see him hanging out with Andy Campos and Richie Martino, seen on the left. According to the daughter of Frank Locascio, Lisa, she would say to the Daily News, quote, her father never even considered cooperation. He was extremely reveled in prison and very respected. There's one word we can use to describe Frank Locascio. It's very simple: respected. From what I can find, from people that were not in the mafia, to his daughter, to his family, to people that just randomly knew him, there was never a bad word said about Frank Locascio. He was extremely Cosa Nostra. He never considered cooperating. Even all he had to say was, I didn't do this. He could have got out from under it. At one point, Frank Locascio, during his sentencing, would get a chance to speak, and he would say something very telling about who he was as a gangster. Emphatically, during his sentence, he would say, quote, first, I would like to say emphatically, I am innocent. I am guilty, though. I'm guilty of being a good friend of John Gotti. And if there were more men like John Gotti on this earth, we would have a better country. Obviously, we can see the respect and affection he has for Gotti. He didn't say anything wrong there. The truth of the matter is, Frank Locascio had no business dying in prison. Whether we can think that maybe at some point he killed someone else, we don't know that. In fact, there's no proof of that. Should Frank Locascio have died in prison? No. And ultimately, we would find out that down the road in 2018, Sammy Gravato would actually pen a letter arguing that Locascio had nothing to do with the killing of DeBono. In 2018, Gravano would say in a letter, quote, he had no role in planning, nor did he participate in any way in that murder. Now, for Frankie Loc, he would assume that this may be a good grounds for compassionate release. Remember, by this point in the late 2010s, Frankie Loc is in his 80s at this point. He had spent essentially the last 30 years of his life in prison and believed that he may be entitled to compassionate release. In 2020, the COVID pandemic would happen, and Frank Locascio would file for compassionate release, and the compassionate release will be heard by the original judge that would sentence him, Judge Leo Glasser. Now, Leo Glasser would respond in a 29-page letter, basically that he would reject the late bid for freedom. In a penned note, he would say, Locaccio's utter silence upon the stark pronouncement bespeaks a wordless assent, affirming the conviction that wordless assent was to a death sentence on DeBono, not because he committed a crime, but worse, only because he did not come in when John Gotti called him. So Glasser's basically saying that he was every bit guilty of Gotti because he didn't stand up and say anything that day. Glasser would, obviously, like I said, reject it. And Frank Locascio would ultimately get COVID-19 in 2020. And by late 2021, he would continue to feel the complications of that bug. His family would ultimately be called as he was placed in comfort care in late September of 2021. Seen here, his daughter Lisa would say that until he passed in early October, she would sing Frank Sinatra songs to Frank Locascio, which he thoroughly enjoyed throughout his life. On October 1st, 2021, Frank Locascio would pass away and succumb to COVID-19 at age 89. One of Frank Locaccio's well wishes and last wishes was he wanted his body inside the coffin to be driven around the Bronx, hopefully in a horse-drawn carriage. I will say one of the most poignant funerals I've ever seen as far as the mafia is concerned. And again, I want to make this clear. I know these guys are all gangsters. I get it. We can contend they were bad guys, and I'm not disputing that. The truth is, though, this funeral was incredibly moving, at least to me. There is a terrific video on YouTube of this funeral and the horse-drawn carriage. It's awesome because they place the coffin inside the carriage, and the horse-drawn carriage drives in and around Frank's old neighborhood. And following the procession is his son and his family, and his daughter can be seen grasping the casket and the carriage at all times. And it's really a celebration of his life. There's a saxophonist there. There's a music ensemble. It's really terrific. It's a beautiful, I think, look. And look, as I've talked about, most of the time, the people and the families of these people really, I think, get a raw deal in the end. Look, we know Salvatore Locascio was likely involved in the mob at one point, but for the most part, his family wasn't. And this was a really terrific send-off. And I'll also put the link to that in the description below. Make sure you go check that out. Frank Locascio, in my estimation, at least as far as I know and the history that I know, is not a murderer. Did he contend that he was a gangster? I don't think he'll dispute that. Obviously, he was around John Gotti. We all know that. No one will dispute that he was a gangster. Did he deserve to die in prison? No, not in my opinion. But this is what we see time and time and time again. The connection to the Gotti family, particularly John Sr., is particularly disastrous to a lot of people. The government hated Gotti. And I think Locaccio's words are pretty poignant. A lot of the life sentence that he got was really just the fact that he was merely a friend to John Gotti. As always, if you enjoy this video, make sure you hit the like button and make sure you subscribe. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.